And I can remember one story told me by a prominent modern monetary theorist that he spent a half a day with a very well-known at the time politician. This person even ran for president, big shot in Washington. And he said, at the end, this politician understood absolutely everything they had shown him about how the real banking system works. And so as they were parting, they said, "You're going to go to Washington now and spread the word, right?" And he said, "Are you out of your minds? The headlines will read, so-and-so says deficits don't matter." He says, "I'll be crucified. This is really interesting, but I can't do anything with this."
And that politician is absolutely wrong. Deficits absolutely do matter. MMT explains why they matter. The federal debt and spending absolutely matters in MMT. Taxation absolutely matters in MMT. The deficit, which is the difference between spending and taxation, absolutely matters in MMT, as does bank lending. But I'm not going to make this primarily a piece about the details of MMT versus, mainstream economics. This is well handled elsewhere by more competent voices than I. What I do want to tackle, though, is what I consider to be the fundamental incompetence of economics as a discipline as a whole. The subject of economics is intrinsically one of public affairs. And public affairs will always inflect or infer on people's moral instincts, which is to say, the essential difficulty reasoning about an economy is oughts, posed as ises. For example, loans as promises is governed by the moral instinct that if you make a promise, you should have the good faith to have the thing to fulfill it. And this just happens to be how we're told bank lending works in a traditional textbook. So, loanable funds, banks as intermediaries between people who have money and people who need money. So, when MMT comes along and says, well, that's not the way banks actually work, you run into two problems. The first landmine comes from violating the rules of a promise I just stated. The second is the moral outrage of generating money from nothing. There is an understandable visceral reaction to the idea that somebody can make a social claim without ever having offered anything, because these are intrinsic moral sensibilities that even young children can express. You will always run into the prospect that someone will never accept banking, creating money from nothing. It insists that one must have what one lends. Furthermore, that sentiment is 100% rational in a social context. Social creatures have to be sensitive to cheating, and making infinite promises you don't have the backing to actually fulfill is almost always cheating. Think Bernie Madoff. Think Ponzi schemes. And the MMT community would be better off explaining up front the actual constraints to lending that the banking system does have, because constraints do exist, like the ability of the borrower to pay the loan and the capital requirements of a bank to indemnify themselves against default. Heterodox and MMT economists willingly step on landmines when they indifferently trigger people's moral instincts. Pause for a moment and consider the reaction people have to Mosler's rather glib assertion that the purpose of a tax is to coerce a currency's use. I think even a 3-year-old could tell Mosler why this line of reasoning is problematic, which can be refuted by any number of reasons, such as taxes existed in commodity currency economies. They existed outside of currency economies. Think feudalism and the feudal lords' taxation of the peasants in goods. Same thing happened in ancient Rome. Tax collection is simplified by a unit of account, one of the two public goods a currency provides. It's certainly better than a tax collector assessing the value of your lawnmower and taking it to satisfy your tax burden. The fundamental effect of taxes is to cull money from the economy, but it also motivates commerce to meet tax obligation. One effect is a regulatory function at a national level, and the other a generic common good. Taxes cast only as a coercive mechanism is also a moral landmine. You're telling people in public that they have to choke down the premise that they are submissive cuckolds to arbitrary power. And only a wanker would insist on arguing about taxes in this manner. That's my reaction to it. I don't know if I'm doing Mosler a disservice, but good Lord, come on. Mosler's characterization of taxation embodies my point. He's inflected a political perspective as plumbing. It's a variant of oughts being treated as ises, in this case in the negative. He's masked the effect of taxation in any monetary system, which is removing money from circulation, to public reasoning, and made MMT the target of people's moral outrage in the process. And I think academics tend to overcomplicate explanations of a mixed fiat credit system. People need only be asked to consider the nature of all their monetary transactions. Money is very clearly a creature of transactions between bank accounts. It doesn't exist outside of them. And in this context, it's a little bit silly to discuss demands for deposits. The demands for deposits is the money supply. There's no demand for deposits. It's the money supply. Because the monetary supply is a creature of bank accounts, one way the federal government can add money to the economy is by putting itself in debt, which is only a negative number in its own bank account with the Federal Reserve, and whose value is then added to bank accounts throughout the economy. It's my bank account, it's your bank account, it's your local coffee shop's bank account. It is the chief component of the money supply, which is only deposits in bank accounts. Bank lending does something similar, but there's a distinction. The bank may put money in the borrower's deposit account, but the borrower is on the hook for more than that amount. They also are on the hook to pay the interest on that loan. The money to pay for that interest charge comes from somewhere else in the monetary system. That chiefly comes from other bank lending. If bank lending subsides, money starts being deleted from the economy because the loans are being paid off. And also defaults figure into this. And the only entity that sustains the money supply is the federal debt and yearly deficit. So the federal government's debt and yearly deficit does matter, as does taxation and bank lending. As long as banks keep on charging interest with their lending, we'll have something called growth and also inflation. The characteristics of a monetary system is determined by the technology it's built upon. A physical ledger, precious metal monetary system has its own distinct characteristics and dynamics. A physical ledger fiat monetary system has its own distinct characteristics and dynamics. And a digital ledger fiat monetary system has its own very distinct characteristics and dynamics. Each system's strengths and weaknesses are easy to describe and reason about, just as it's easy to understand why a applying the characteristics of one to another is a disaster. Just so with mainstream monetary theory. It's got its feet stuck in the precious metal and fiat paper currency systems and is entirely ignorant and indifferent to the system we actually use.